He's a professor from the Colegio de Mexico. He has a PhD from the Colegio de Mexico in International Affairs as well. And there's not really much to say about him because I think we are all very familiar with him and what he does. He's an influencer. And he's somebody who has always helped us to have a better understanding of what's happening in the world. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor to Lorenzo. The
dijo que ya estuvo bien de hablar de precortesianos en México.
The other day I heard somebody say that we should stop talking about pre-Cortez. We should now start to talk pre-Cortez and post-Cortez. And we should now start to talk about pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic. I'd like to propose something. I'd like to propose that we talk about a topic that I'm very interested in. I've devoted almost half my life to studying the topic. Which is the relationship between my country and the US. But I think it could also be applied to Latin America on the whole. I'm going to talk about the political influence, although that's accompanied by the economic and cultural influence as well. But I want to, during my presentation, try to limit myself to the political side of things. And I'm also going to try to focus on Mexico. Although it doesn't just apply to us, it could also apply to the rest of Latin America. And since my focus is going to be historic, I'm going to very quickly start off as follows. Yes, I'll get closer to the mic. The two Americas, North America and Latin America, don't have much in common in terms of its beginning. Perhaps we could entitle this presentation "The Shadow of North America on Latin America." Initially, it didn't seem that that would be the case. The geographic concentration of the 13 colonies and their project, initially as colonies and afterwards as a nation, was thought on contact with be the last stage of the Spanish Empire and the start of the. But how have things evolved? And here I'm going to give you just very broad strokes. I think when we started to see the creation of a national subsystem centered on the US and certain Latin American countries on the periphery, was because what was happening in 1846 to 1848 in the US-Mexico War. That was a decisive turning point. In many studies, we've seen that wars destroy nations, and in our case, the war acted as a stepping stone to the expansion of the US. For a moment, the relationship between the different parts of the US, because of what was happening in Mexico, had an impact. And that first subsystem in our continent also quickly started to include Central America and part of the Caribbean. That was during the second half of the 19th century. And there was also the effort on the part of Europe of stopping the US in Mexico, to put some constraints, to set up a wall of constraint around the US. The Mexican system was still one that was far from being a nation, and that led to the invasion of France. And the French army came to Mexico, and in general, you would say that it achieved its goal. Sometimes in Mexico, we'll say, oh no, we managed to beat them here and we managed to stop them there. But the truth is that it was a very modern army, and ours was barely the start of a national army. But that European effort to constrain US influence in Latin America and Mexico failed. And it failed very quickly and very obviously. The US was unable to use its Monroe Doctrine because it was in its own civil war. But as soon as the Civil War was over, as soon as one of the two large factions in Mexico was able to establish itself, that is to say, the liberals over the conservatives, the possibility of having a serious political European presence in Mexico was lost. The European presence in Mexico was different from that of Argentina and in the Southern Cone, where it was quite active. Here, the North American powers took hold, and in the second half of the 19th century, they had a significant area of influence, even in spite of the fact that it was still not a great power, even when they defeated Spain here in America, in the American continent and in the Philippines. It was still a power that was in the process of being consolidated. They had done quite a bit, but they still had much to do. And Europe was trying to defend itself. The defeat of Spain was the defeat of one of the weakest nations in Europe. At the end of the 19th century and at the start of the 20th century, we started to see that there were two international subsystems, one around the US, in which we include Mexico, Central Caribbean, and Venezuela, and Colombia. In Venezuela, the US stopped the European influence when they tried to punish Venezuela for not paying up their debts. But on the other hand, I'm not an expert in this field, but there was also a type of Brazilian core of another dominant regional power. And there could have been two subsystems. The Brazilian system is one that I don't fully understand, but I do understand the US system. World War I opened the gates, wore out Europe. They hadn't seen a slaughter of the size of World War I previously. But it was the US Civil War that was perhaps a prologue to World War I, because there they also killed each other off in large numbers because it was an industrial war. But the US was too busy occupying its vast territory that runs from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But World War I truly changed things. From the Latin American point of view, the Mexican Revolution also changed certain circumstances or certain variables. The US ended up being the power that won World War I in the sense that it had very few human losses. And economically speaking, it came out better than it went into the war, which was not the case for England, Germany, nor France. Those three countries were very negatively impacted, and the US was able to expand its territory and its capacity. The Mexican Revolution started in 1910, and if you bear in mind foreign investment as an indicator, just an indicator, perhaps it's not very appropriate, but I could get the impression that with those types of numbers, we can see that there was a balance in the investments being made in Europe, by Europe on the whole, England, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, on the whole, their investment, their direct investment, and in bonds in Mexico, and it was equal to the North American. And everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but they were involved in everything: railways, mining, industrial agriculture, and maybe a tiny bit in industry. After the Mexican Revolution, between 1913 and 1914, and before the start of World War I, the US once again put a stop to the influence of Europeans in Mexico, much in the same way that France had done that in the 1800s. During the Mexican Revolution, they put a stop on particularly the British. They said, politically speaking, nothing will change unless you ask me first. And there were some odd events in which the
y fusilamos al señor Benton porque había lo insultó y lo fusilamos. Yo no acepto el reclamo norteamericano sobre un súbdito inglés. Y los ingleses dicen, pero si tú eres
on a UK citizen, and the others would say, but this is your field of influence, this is your area of influence. And so the US gradually became responsible for filing claims for the French, English, Spanish, Chinese because of the Mexican Revolution. And the Mexican administration defended itself by saying, legally, you have nothing to do here, but they did. So in my view, that part of the internal process that was taking place that was very hard on the people opened the door to making it clear that Europeans cannot get involved in
y con sus sombras, sus más oscuro aquí, más claro acá.
And what has happened with the shadow, darker shadows in some points, lighter in others, because it has also affected Argentina. Not only it's but also in the periphery. And we saw clearly that Brazil was not going to be able to compete against the US as the strongest power. The US took possession. In Mexico's case, Panama was unable to do, which was the Panama Canal. They started it, but they failed, and so the US took on the task. Once it was built, they told English, you're backing Victoriano Huerta's coup d'etat in Mexico. We don't want that to happen. Assessment that the institutionalization of politics within the standards that were used in advanced leadership. And so we had to open the Mexican system, let Porfirio Diaz come in to power and institutionalize a political system that was in the interest to be another revolution. And so the best way to do so would be to institute such as how to transfer power peacefully, which is always very difficult when we're talking about dictatorships. And so the Mexican Revolution resolved the problem relatively well. So the US told England that the channel, the Panama Canal was going to be open rather, but they were also very interested in the Mexican system. And so they said, if you continue with how you've been handling things, I'm going to be charging you a different fee when you cross the canal, and you're a power, a seafaring power. And so it would turn out worse for you. So the English understood the message very clearly. In their internal memos, they insulted President Wilson, saying that he was an imbecile, that he didn't know how to reach agreements. The way they knew how to treat the peoples of Africa and India. And that's why they had power. But in any case, they submitted to their wishes. And as to Germany, because perhaps now that so many years have passed, it might make us kind of smile, but Chancellor Zimmerman wanted to make sure that Mexico and the US would start a war so that the US wouldn't get involved in a war in Europe. Although the US didn't really have an army, it had a navy. Between 1914 rather and 1915, it didn't have a navy. It had an army that was easy for them to call up. So when Carranza was offered the possibility of entering an alliance to go into a war against the US, one might think, who would have such an absurd idea? But at the time, they didn't think it was and it was done through the Zimmerman telegram that was very famous, that was sent by a US submarine to the German delegation through Washington, and obviously the British intercepted it. So that was one of the formal reasons to go into war. German trade was closed off against Mexico. When the US went into the war, it also closed off trade with Latin America. So Germans lost their opportunity in Mexico and Latin America. And the English agreed to what they wanted, what the US wanted in Mexico. I don't know what happened in the other countries in Latin America. They started a dominant.
Y el presidente Roosevelt, que ese sí le funcionaba las neuronas muy bien, las piernas no, pero las neuronas.
Who had very effective neurons. Perhaps his legs weren't that good, but his neurons were very good. And he decided to try to approach Latin America as a whole, not just Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. He wanted to get closer to all of Latin America in the 30s, and he proposed a good neighbor policy. Good neighbor. That is to say, the sheep and the wolf were going to become very good neighbors. The term good neighbor is not a term initiated by Roosevelt, it was Hoover's. But Hoover never even had an opportunity to do anything about it. It was Roosevelt that actually did anything about it. And so he spoke about the importance of soft power, benign power. The US accepted the unilateral non-intervention in its zone of influence in order to have a good relationship with Latin America, just as the international system was cracking. And it actually plan. And we also have in mind what happened with the oil expropriation process. And it couldn't do so because there were no recriminations. He could have told Cárdenas, Roosevelt told Cárdenas that he couldn't do that, but
Brasil y México, ahí van. Los dos. Ustedes y yo
as well. I think maybe all of us remember a Walt Disney film entitled The Three Caballeros. It was a cartoon and had Donald Duck representing the US, Jose Carioca representing Brazil, and Pancho Pistolas representing Mexico. And the three traveled all over the continent in their struggle against Nazis, fascists. And it was an era of relative harmony between the wolf. Well, why don't we just say a moment of harmony between the sardines and the shark. But after the war, once Germany had been defeated, we saw the Cold War come into play. And that was interesting because that's what explains the point at which we find ourselves right now. The Cold War, which I sometimes view World War One had a rest period afterwards. Then World War II was the continuation of World War One and continuation of World War II or World War One. So all of this has been handled, at least it hasn't been resolved appropriately. And that whole concept of being a good neighbor was left by the wayside for a lengthy period. Perhaps Roosevelt might have leave, but Truman was hard. He had a different point of view of the world. He would say it's the Soviets against the Americans, it's dictatorship against democracy, Manichaean. There was no way in which they could have any wiggle room. And what could have been the continuation of Guatemala in the 50s by going to indigenous communities and handing out land, finding a way of reaching social peace. It all plummeted because of a relatively direct intervention of the US. That's where the whole concept of non-intervention disappeared. There was an intervention, a very lightly veiled intervention on the part of the US, and that was going to be the formula to determine Latin Americans' participation in the Cold War. Latin America, or at least
y otros países latinoamericanos, no sé con cuánta fuerza otros, no, vamos a continuar con la buena vecindad. La alianza tiene que ser ahora económica. Si hay un plan Marshall para Europa, debe de
with their good neighbor policy. And they wanted to make because they wanted to have a Latin America that was capable and that would be a good consumer.
It wasn't a hit. When that became a political and military alliance and partnership with the OAS, when everything became harder, the Bogotazo was seen as a premonition that could happen to the rest of Latin America. And we must be strong to avoid this happening in Guatemala, which wasn't on its way, but in Mexico. The center is American safety imposed in Latin America with militant activities and military men. That must be its core. Of course, we talk about economy and cooperation. We always talk about that, but the idea was very clear on behalf of the US. If you want American investment to develop, you have to facilitate the private sector, and that is that. We won't have loans as in Europe's reconstruction. We're not going to reconstruct you, rebuild you. You're not destroyed. This is simply the market. So they emphasized security, and that is when in 1954, the Guatemalan intervention. Arbenz was taken down, Castillo Armas came up, and that was the principle of a long-lasting civil war in Guatemala that until recently it was more or less resolved. The support to strong anti-communist governments is constant. Then one started entering their sphere of influence in Cuba. Cuba was a disruption for the US. And what they're going to do is encapsulate Cuba. They can't invade it because the Soviet presence was already there. And the Cold War allows Cuba not to be invaded. It's an anomaly within the structure of hegemonic systems. The big power has to admit that 90 miles away from Miami, as I love to repeat time and time again, this socialist system aligned with the Soviets, their enemy. And atomic weapons are the ones that make the difference. All previous wars, all of them can be set to one side and atomic war on the other. Atomic war ensures mutual destruction. And that is why the US have to restrain itself. Although they did consider that, and Kennedy was advised to invade Cuba. Despite all the rockets, the Soviet rockets that were there, if one was launched, we were going to see what was going to happen. That situation will last from the 60s until the end of the Soviet Union, until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So the point that I would like to stress is that now, without the Cold War and only the remnants of the Cold War, a new stage is opened in the relationship between the Latin American countries and the US. The United States is no longer interested for their own security, for all governments to be right-leaning like Pinochet's. They don't invade, but rather they use conservative forces within each country to ensure the power of those forces allied with the US in the anti-communist fight and submit the Latin American countries that were leaning towards the left or the center, who were demanding and looking for more political independence and ways to have different economic development pathways, different from those in the US and the international agencies that had that vision. But with the end of the Cold War, the US stopped feeling like they had to have the control of Latin American governments with political parties that were friendly with it. And we started to see a certain relative independence in Latin America. The US continued in its fight against Russia. It is clear that it's not against communism, it's against Russia. Tocqueville told us in the 19th century that the big war was going to happen between the US and Russia. And this happened in the 19th century. So it's against Russia and now against China. China has not messed too much with Latin America. They have influenced Asia, and the US is committed to not tolerating China in Latin America, and they haven't reached a critical point yet. So it's easy to see how in the Mexican case in 1988, still, the electoral fraud against Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas' candidacy responds to previous visions. United States takes a blind eye. Everything was okay in those elections. Everything was normal. And in a certain way, rewards the 88 fraud with the free trade agreement that Salinas proposes. So we're now part and things are going great. But then the Cold War ends, and it is possible for the Mexican case to open the long lasting system that we have in Latin America, similar to the one that was started by the triumph of Carranza followers in 1916, that will have an impact in the political sphere, not the economical sphere, until the year 2000. I can suggest that the end of the Cold War is tied to not repeating the case of such an open fraud and clear and evident against the opposition. And they let the authoritarian system to break away a little bit. Then we had Fox, and finally in 2018, we get Morena and Andres Manuel López Obrador, which was unthinkable during the Cold War era. And here we have Chile and Lula and the comings and goings in Argentina, Uruguay, and now Colombia. And they don't intervene anymore. If Colombia goes on its own, maybe they won't renew the agreements that the Colombian military has with the American military. I mean, they will have that ties or not, but it's not a global fight anymore. It's a much more localized struggle. So my vision is that we are entering a period in Latin America in which we can work if there is political will and political smarts to increase the relative independence of Latin America. Now, getting rid of the US being the center for international affairs, the hegemonic center of all that, well, that is very difficult, but it is not impossible to negotiate. Areas of relative independence. In Mexico, we are not the only ones who are trying this with their corresponding issues, because each change, for example, in the cabinet, yesterday, the Secretary of Economy left the cabinet, and all these speculations are being heard. It's because the negotiations with the United States, the American factor is ever present in everything. And Ken Salazar is going to Zacatecas, making a deal with the governor to see if the American presence with the DA and the FBI can stop that horrible situation of lack of security in Zacatecas state. But it is no longer the communists. I mean, drug dealers, drug traffickers must be taken into account, but it's no longer a worldwide conspiracy that tries to destroy the US or political systems that are alike to the United States. It's another type of policy, much more pulverized policy that allows relative independence to bloom. And it will be up to us and the ability of Latin American elites and their ability to connect with social bases and mobilize them to stop the US with a barrier. In Colombia, we have had a series of presidents that have been very much backed by the US, who now had to acknowledge the defeat and recognize the victory of a former member of the guerrilla, part of the left wing, yet it is no longer seen as a deadly danger by the US. Who knows what that new danger will be? In the second half of the 20th century, we talked about the American sanctuary. People said that this was a century where the US imposed itself in the world. In the 21st century, we're now hesitating about saying whether the 21st century will be the American century as well. First of all, there are no longer clear ideologies anymore. And Americans don't have such a clear idea of where they're going as a world power, especially because of China, who is going and going and going. And quite quickly, for historic standards, the positioning of China as a big power is surprisingly quick. American think tanks say it'll deflate. It's not going okay. Soon, more or less, the economy will burst because you can't have a prosperous economy under that type of capitalism with only one political party and a communist party. It will come crumbling down. But I've been listening to this for a while now, and it's not crumbling down. So, how will we reach the half of the 21st century? Well, probably in some cases, Chinese influence will increase, and then, therefore, the big power in the region, this is a possibility, will have to generate a policy again that is equivalent to that which they created against the Soviet Union. But in the meanwhile, we're in this intermediate space. We don't know if the centrist or leftist governments will be successful in America, whether they're going to be crumbling down, whether we're entering a true political transformation era, and our relationship with technology continues to be ruled by the symmetry of power. American power may be diminishing in relative terms, but for us Latin Americans, it continues to be overwhelming. And we need to know how to negotiate the fractures of something that was very rigid during the Cold War, which was American control on Latin America. It is no longer the case, and maybe, if we're lucky, we can open spaces of certain independence and freedom in terms of the Latin American national systems. And that is all. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. What a wonderful presentation. This history lecture allows us to have solid elements to locate the cross section in which we found ourselves right now. As a commentator, I really love this story of the Mexican and US relationship in the long term. I would like to ask you two, three questions. There is a notion in Mexico generally, I don't know if it's the same in Latin America, that democratic governments in the US tend to be better for Latin America and Mexico in comparison to Republican governments or administrations. We tend to say this. This is an illusion. Going back to what happened in Mexico and Latin America in the 2000s, I would like to stress that during the Bush Jr. administration between 2001 and 2009, the government really didn't stop what in Europe was called the pink wave, the victory of different progressive movements in Latin America that began in Venezuela, that has been moving forward throughout this last decade. However, when Barack Obama took office with Hillary Clinton in the Department of State, a new strategy started in the US of intervening with these soft coups. Honduras immediately in 2009, then Paraguay, and Brazil in 2016. And there is not just this interventionism, but very strong efforts to contain the development of these progressive governments, throwing money to Kirchner's opposition in Argentina, etc. And then what happened? Trump took office and was in office from 2017 until 2021. And I don't think that it's happenstance that in 2018, the victory was acknowledged of this political core that started with the candidacy of the Democratic Front led by Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas that we tried to have in 2006, and the fraud in 2012. And with Trump, the leftist victory in Mexico was finally acknowledged. And in my opinion, the Bolivian coup d'etat was reversed, which is very interesting because I do believe that the Bolivian people did punish Evo Morales because of his reelection after having lost the referendum. There's this coup d'etat, but a year later, well, there was support by Mexico and the Argentinian government, the rescue of Evo Morales. The movement towards socialism went back to Bolivia. During Trump, again, I would like to stress that fact. The relationship between Andrés López Obrador and Trump. Andrés López Obrador is very slippery. And when we check the press during those days, Trump says on the one hand, let's build the wall, and the conservative factions of the Mexican government accuse AMLO that they're too weak. And Lopez Obrador basically says, let him talk. He's going to build a wall. We're going to pay for it, whatever. Nothing happened. The growth rate of this wall didn't really increase. So I do this conceptualization because I would like to know your opinion about it, because now we have Biden's administration and it's a very different context, because what we have with Biden is the pandemic on the one hand and this European war now, that in my opinion is a proxy war, where the main contradiction in my opinion is the hegemonic conflict between China, a raising power, and the US, which continues to be the main power. And the US, as always, prefers to resolve these issues in Europe. European governments are committing the same mistake again. I think that the only ones that could have negotiated that war not happening could have been Europe, the European Union. And once again, the US gives the weapons, the military industry, the energy industry in the US is booming. The casualties will be given by the Europeans. So my question is, how do you think the role will be of this relationship between Mexico and the US? Because this piece of news of the ambassador going to Zacatecas, engaging in this a deal between the DEA and the government to decrease violence in Zacatecas, or the agreement, or the president of, or the summit that we had in the, of the countries that basically aims at decreasing the role of the OAS. I would like to talk more about this and something more specific to Mexico. In the economic realm and in the demographic realm, the true Mexico-American border is ever more diluted. The levels of integration of productive supply chains between the US and Mexico is super strong. We have 40, 50 million Latinos, mostly Mexicans, living in the US. So this has changed the demography of the US completely. And we now have Marcelo Ebrard going to LA to promote programs like Sembrando Vida in Los Angeles. So in this context, and having heard your presentation about the long-term context, as a moderator of this discussion, I would like to ask you these questions on top of the questions that we will hear from the audience. Thank you very much. The question started with the difference between Democrat and Republican governments and their impacts in Latin America. Maybe during the first few years of the last century, there may have been a difference. A president like Wilson's, every time I talk about Wilson, I talk about Wilson the good guy and Wilson the bad guy, because sometimes we make it mixed with the Wilson that we had in Mexico. But President Wilson, a Democrat, president almost by accident because he wasn't really focused on that. He was a professor, but he got into local politics and then the Democratic Party to ensure that he stopped meddling in local politics. They made him a presidential candidate and he won. So things were upside down for them. He did have an interesting project because the Mexican Revolution just happened when he entered the White House. And some of the documents on the Mexican Revolution were written by Wilson in his famous little black machine that is now in museums. He himself wanted to give teachings to his students and to Mexicans. But he did have a very interesting vision. The Mexican nationalism really disrupted Wilson, and we had this intervention in Veracruz to oust Huerta. He wanted to oust this dictator that had just murdered the president that was elected in a more or less democratic election, the most democratic that we could have in the Mexican context. And it was a short-term solution, not a long-term solution. And yes, in that case, the Democrat administration with that long-term strategy did agree with an attempt to institutionalize Mexico, not because of love for Mexicans, particularly because Wilson was a racist and very much a racist, but as a political scientist, he saw the scenario and said, we're going to have another revolution here because there will be another uprising against Huerta, and this story will never end. And our investments in Mexico and our interest in having a stable neighbor will be done. And this is a peculiarity that we have because we're their neighbors. And the stability of Mexico is part of Americans' homeland security in a very direct way, unlike any other country in Latin America. And with Roosevelt in the 30s and in the Second World War, there was also a long-term vision, not just involving Mexico, but also Latin America. But it tolerates the oil expropriation and the land expropriation.
At some point, their ambassador, who had previously been his boss in Washington, dared to disobey the State Department thanks to their personal direct relationship with Roosevelt. And maybe it was just a coincidence, but they also worked with, we were talking about two very interesting and very smart presidents, although one was from one party and the other one was from another. And in that sense, when talking about later presidents, Democrats or Republicans, they always had their own interests. And they were somewhat indifferent to the party. What? What am I supposed to, what was the question? I'm sorry, he's not speaking into a mic and I can't hear him. Oh, yes. There's a book that really caught my attention. I think it was published initially 10 years ago. It's entitled The Next Century by the creator of a center, strategic forecast center in Austin as to where the US will have conflicts in the 21st century. And it does very well. And so they analyze the relationship with the US, China, Turkey, and they focused on 10 different scenarios. And they proposed solutions so that the US could move ahead. And they said, and the last scenario is with Mexico. And I thought, why? What about Mexico? Why is there going to be a conflict of direct face-off against the US and Mexico? And he referred there to the conflict between Mexicans and Mexican Americans that are an important demographic in the US. He said that there was a contradiction between, because they were loyal to both sides, and if there were to be a conflict, they didn't know how they would vote, because the demographics is on the rise in terms of a greater segment of the population being of Mexican origin. And if the states in the north take very tough positions vis-a-vis Mexico because of migration, drugs, and so on, for whatever reason, it's likely that in certain states they would not follow the policy. And so that is where there might be issues between Mexico and Washington. I don't know. This gentleman seems to be serious about what he says, so that might happen. In any case, the book is entitled The Next 100 Years. I'm sorry, there's a comment from the audience I can't hear. And now I'm wondering if I recall the name properly. It has something to do with the next century. No, it's not that one. Well, in any case, the point is that he himself doubts the North American system's capacity to face off against Mexico, and maybe it wouldn't be able to do it by force. They could do it with everybody else, with China, Russia, and so on. But here it would be so complicated that I don't know how they would overcome the problem. Oh, well, that's typical of politics. There are a lot of unknowns. Our science, political science, isn't actually a science. It's just an effort. Well, it is a science, but maybe not a real science. So there's still a lot of unknowns. You also refer to the fact that the US continues to insist on having all-out wars, in this case against Russia, and that they use proxies. They use NATO, and NATO uses Ukraine. The story of Ukraine is fraught with complications, and in World War II, they realized that that's one of their soft spots, because the Germans went through it very easily, and they almost defeated the Soviet Union. So that part of Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe was like their safety net. And when NATO slowly got closer and closer, Gorbachev said that the US verbally committed to not getting into that sphere of influence, but they only said it verbally. There's actually no commitment in that sense. And they're trying to make NATO get a little bit closer, and the Ukraine is the battlefield. The US continues to be a very hard imperial power that defends its zones of influence globally. And what I would say that in the case of Latin America, it's a little less, but we do have to remember what's happened in Bolivia, Venezuela, as they did what they could because they preferred right-leaning presidents. But since they have so many open fronts, and by the way, that's one of the advantages of a country such as our own, like Mexico. Mexico only has to deal with the US. Aside from that, there's nothing else to deal with. Whereas the US has dozens of contact points. And sometimes they have to rid themselves of the least important ones. And that's where we have to come in and be smart and take advantage of those points in time. But if they were to actually really let us loose, they are still a very strong imperial power. And it would have an impact on us, and we would have to think about the consequences. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Are there any questions from either the audience here or virtually? Oscar, I have a comment regarding South America. Brazil was an empire, a Portuguese, part of the Portuguese Empire. And Brazilians never looked towards South America. They always look towards Europe. Perhaps they continue to do that. And also, with regard to the British presence, that was an important presence. So much so that when Blaine proposed negotiations, peace negotiations for Chile and Peru, he said that this was a proxy war between the English and them, and that they had to neutralize the situation, and he sent his child to negotiate it. But then there were problems there, and that's when they organized the first conference for Latin America. So you have the British presence in the South, and the Brazilians did not focus on South America. And yet, the counterpoint to Washington's power was Brazil. Brazil was who guaranteed all the peace agreements, and they are the ones who guarantee what happens in South America. If Brazil doesn't go in, it won't work. I was very involved in the creation of the financial processes of South America. And that was a failed effort because Brazil didn't participate. It has been this, and with that they finance whatever they want. And they don't necessarily have anything to do with South America. And then they launched the BRICS Bank afterwards. So Brazil wasn't very much involved with South America, but it was always ensuring that agreements would be fulfilled. So there's the Brazilian pole and the Argentinian pole. And that's something we've seen since '89 with the first Pan American Conference, in which they were consistently turning towards Washington, the FMI, the IMF, sorry, and the playing field. But that's another scenario. And that's a field I'm going to be researching, is what Chile is doing in the energy sector. The Caribbean basin it seems to be losing its position. You have the different countries with their own resource wealth. Colombia is different, Central America is different, and in Mexico, there's one project in Sonora. So it's the Chinese that are also in South America in the field of energy and renewables. And it's either for power generation or mass transport, such as trolley bus, subway systems, and so on. So there is going to be perhaps some conflicts with the US. Up until now, the only conflict we've seen was in Ecuador, when the Secretary of State came to talk with the presidential winner and bought out their debt. That's the only case which is similar to what happened with the purchase of the German debt in Nicaragua for the purchase of the railway towards the Atlantic coast. At least that's the only case I'm familiar with. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And my question is because I'd like to know, in this new scenario, in this context, where energy is also very important because of changes that have been taking place, because it would seem that there has been a certain amount of energy stability over the past few years, and that we had diversification. We had a lot of our countries had significant grids, and our energy indicators pointed to the fact, because there were several agencies that would publish that information. But now I'm interested in the fact, and that's why I'd like to know your opinion, that I wonder if this might change the relationship with the US, because when the war started, it would seem that the US spoke with Venezuela. And what I see, that is in terms of oil, but there are also new players in renewables and the raw materials for renewables. And that's very interesting, because if you look at the data, the raw materials required for the transition, especially if we want to encourage electromobility, the biggest producers are Chinese, and they're competing with Russians. So though we don't have a lot of numbers in that sense, because we can't measure materials reserves, I don't know if perhaps that might change in the future, because there are also Latin American countries, Mexico itself, with lithium, although it's not the only one. But there are other players as well. And I don't know, maybe that would lead to a change in the relationship, if it might change with Latin America, or if it might ultimately lead to more conflicts, bearing in mind the hegemony that currently exists. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Lorenzo. Could you please expand, please, because Mexico is very interested in the confrontation between the US and China. Everybody's interested because they say that the bigger the differences between them, the more the US will want to work more with Mexico. I would say that what's happening there is very complex. And perhaps what the US rhetoric says isn't that clear. Trump made changes and incentives to make sure that US companies would return to the US from China. But that hasn't affected everybody. Right now, there's a conflict between the US and China, and also with US and Russia. But in the case of US and China, the relationship is very close, very intertwined, and they can't really separate because of how close they are, and because the Chinese have a significant part of the US reserves. So I don't know what you would think about that confrontation. Perhaps the US would want to replace its imports, and they're investing in chips and other devices, as if with that they'll be solving their problems, because those are industries that need to mature. I think that's where we're seeing a dispute between two economic powers. One that's a burgeoning economy with a very large economy, and just on size alone, it's important. And another power. And also, let's not forget the military situation. So perhaps once again, we're going to be seeing changes taking place in the world. Bearing that in mind, what do you think about Latin America's position? Thank you. Very quickly, and just to build upon what has already been said, I think that the topic of reindustrialization or effort to reindustrialize the US with the programs that they've set up is, I think, just the start of what they're trying to do. But I think it's very significant, and I think it's a pivoting on the part of the US that is not just going to be for this particular point in time, rather it's going to be long term. I think that the heart of the empire in the past has been its industry, but lately it's lost its hegemony, its global presence, and so that's why it's going to go back to industrialization. So now that we're seeing this pivoting taking place, I think they're going to rethink the relationships that they have all over the world, and maybe they'll also bear in mind what to do with Latin America, because they could do things with Latin America because of the power they have here, and the shadow that they cast has been lighter than it has been in the past. So although industrially and technologically speaking, they're against the wall vis-a-vis China, I think they're going to move into a second stage. And if they're able to recover part of their power, then I assume that it's going to change history. Thank you very much for that presentation. I wanted to bring something up that I've thought about in the past. I get the impression that ideology is very important. There are those who believe that economy is the only thing that's important, but I believe that the US had an ideology initially of international trade. And just like England, its economic power has been losing ground. Perhaps the situation is similar to what happened in the 30s, when the situation was different. Perhaps militarily they were strong, but not economically. So I don't know if now is an opportunity for Mexico to start to rethink its industrial policies. The US no longer has an old-fashioned industrial policy with large factories and so on. They're going to start to specialize in certain fields and certain niches. Do you still think that Mexico can have the opportunity to do what we've always wanted to do, but we're never able to do? Because now we're seeing all these problems coming up. Sometimes you want to take the next steps, but things have changed. Do you think Mexico is in a good position to be able to make changes and adapt? I think that here we're talking about a new strategic conflict between the US and China. And I think that they have two strategic interests. One is the issue of energy, which is in the field of energy. But I think that there are differences. Everybody speaks of climate change, but it's basically because of their national interests. I think the US now has oil sovereignty. It has oil, the energy it needs in that sense, and they don't care if they have to use their oil and affect climate change because they're focusing on their national interests and they don't have to care about anybody else. And they can say, nobody has to, but in my life, and I don't need anybody else. China, for example, is much more interested in climate change because they don't have as many alternatives energy-wise. And that's why they have to seek out new sources of energy. The same thing that happened with Chile. Chile had problems, and so they set up a wind farm in the desert in Atacama, and solar energy, and now they work basically with solar energy. So at the core, it's actually part of the national interest, but China needs supplies, copper, lithium, oil, and so on for its own industries, which is why they're here in Latin America, seeking out all of these products wherever they can. US isn't interested in that. And I think that's what's been happening and why Chinese companies aren't bothered by the US. I think that the point of strategic conflict is what's happening on the trade front with Huawei, for example, where the US with its 5 big tech companies has dominated the market. And thinking in terms of the future, China is the strategic competition. And clearly they've been able to establish the conditions through 5G, but in Latin America, it doesn't seem that they're fighting over whether they're going to opt for Chinese or US technology. And there, I think that China knows that since its power is relatively less and they don't have the raw materials, they're not going to get into it with US. I don't think they're willing to fight till the death. I think they would cede some ground in that sense. That's the way I see the scenario right now. And oddly enough, in the field of industrialization, I think the biggest problem here would be China. China, not the US, because they have inexpensive clothing and everything, inexpensive industry that comes from China, not the US. There, it's more complementary than competition. So I think that in Latin America, we should rethink how to handle that scenario. That combination, oddly enough, we don't have as many contradictions with the US right now, economically speaking. We have more contradictions with China because of the raw materials required in the industry, and I don't think we're necessarily taking that into account. Latin America is basically saying, okay, give us some money or give us a line of credit, we'll give you some raw materials, and we'll do the industrialization afterwards. The whole issue of the economic model, the neoliberal system is clashes more with China than the US. I don't know, that's my opinion. Okay, who else has a question that they'd like to pose? Okay, so then instead of going to a second round of questions, let's just give her the floor, if that's the only question that's left. Yes, it's a comment. There was recently a defense conference in Ecuador with Laura Bitterson, and it was held in Ecuador, and she referred to how the region was getting much closer to China. There were some declarations to that effect. But I wanted to ask you, a lot has been said about the CELAC, but I don't think anybody's ever spoken about defense. In that sense, I don't know if any important decisions were reached in that sense, and that's a point that I wanted to remind you of, because they spoke about cybersecurity, and that's also connected to another point. I don't know exactly what you were referring to earlier, sir, but I remember that in 2020, Mike Pence went to Ecuador, but he ultimately gave us 35 million pesos, dollars rather, which wasn't much.
Colombia received $5 billion in that period. And in general, we had many displaced Colombians, of which we don't talk enough. So there's this whole important topic because Colombia stopped being so much aligned to the traditional axis, and they went into Ecuador because the famous Assange that was in the UK's that we had this fiasco of in the end, but there are some other issues that are not related to commerce or trade or industrial topics, but rather related to what concerns them. So what can we do in the region to avoid them joining in terms of defense, and also avoid us getting scraps in exchange? The concrete support given to us by the US, top of the $35 million, was the agreement that we had. Thank you very much. Lorenzo, you have the floor. These were questions that I can't answer. These are positions at the same level, equal to equal. What can I say? I can make the topic more complex, and the only thing that I could say is that I agree. I can't say anything else. What was said about the peculiarity of Brazil, yes, Brazil is also one of the topics that are most discussed. Mexico doesn't really get to see Brazil, and Brazil doesn't really get to see Mexico. If we talk about a possibility, the halal, maybe who opposed Brazil, and Mexico couldn't really do anything despite all the wonders that our technicians and theorists mentioned. Brazil simply said no, on top of what you mentioned. Uh, Brazil doesn't look at Latin America. They're in another world, but it does look at the US. They do have to look up to them. And in pivotal points, like the Second World War, the Brazilians did contribute with the most military offering in Latin America. We gave raw materials, Mexico gave labor that Brazilians couldn't provide, but their military support was not decisive, of course, but it was significant in terms of Latin America. So Brazil is a separate story, yes. Would you say that there could have been two hegemonies, the American in the north part of the continent and the Brazilian in the southern part of the continent with someone in the middle? Not anymore. Okay, but they did invade what could have invaded. They did get some of the territory, right? And they did create their current map. Brazil, let's say, the idea of integrating the Plata Basin is a Brazilian notion of the 80s when republics were declared. The idea was discussed to incorporate the La Plata region, Uruguay and Argentina. And this idea is the idea that survived the 45 conference in Montevideo that very soon everyone will know about because I will publish the article. This is a dark conference organized by Bolivians, Paraguayans, and it's the first multilateral trade conference and the first multilateral integration conference because they talked about infrastructure, health, navigation, etc. Brazil sabotaged that. If it's Bolivia leading a proposal, they sabotage it. ALAC took the same countries in the 41st conference, incorporating Peru as observer in 41, and above Peru, there's no one, no Ecuador, no Colombia, no Venezuela, no Central America. And forget about Mexico. Who said no was Brazil, because they're thinking about their 1890 proposal of the La Plata Basin. So I now hear Lula talk about integration, and after seeing the performance of Brazil, I wonder, what do they mean by integration? Because in the end, Brazil, in that period when it was a stakeholder with a strong voice, at the end of the day, they stepped down. Who didn't place the 3 billion was Brazil. So what is your conclusion, that Brazil has its own project, Brazil? But it's not even imperialist, because no, it doesn't care. They're looking at the world. They're looking at the world. Europe, Asia, Africa. Their main economic partner is China. The main direct foreign investor is China. The main new predator is China, just like Latin America. So they're looking at China. And in China, they're looking at Asia very actively. Good conclusion. Yes. I have to take all that into account into my vision from Mexico about Latin America. The complexity of facing the US also involves the complexity of facing Brazil, because since the 19th century, we talked about the possibility of having, I mean, the Colegio de Mexico, a book was published about the Mexico-Brazil relations, and in actuality, it's a very ethereal possibility that does not have any material foundations, that is simply left for a rainy day. And our concern in Mexico and in neighboring countries continues to be the US. And I believe that in the rest of Latin America, this is still very far-fetched. Despite the fact that we are closer, yes, but Brazil was much more present in many investments with the Caribbean than Mexico. It was surprising, but it was the case. Well, what can I say? Uh, I don't have much to say. I would prefer to listen. I will simply keep on reflecting until I'll die. Thank you very much, Lorenzo, and thank you very much to everyone. I think that this collective reflection was very nice. Thank you very much. This was very nice.